Okay, so here we are in our second video on research methods. The second video is going to focus on the scientific research method. Video number 3 is going to focus on the interpretive research method. Again, occasionally during this video, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and reference course material on our course Canvas site. So real quick, just wanted to show you where that all is. It's under February 2nd, and you'll see links to all this material. So when I mention that during the video, that's what I'm talking about. All right, so approaches to sociological research, as I mentioned, there's two approaches, the scientific approach, the sort of interpretive approach. Let's not worry about this right now. We're going to talk about this in video number 3. In the second video, we're going to focus on the scientific method. And the goal really here is to provide this sort of systematic, organized approach to collecting data that focuses on objectivity and consistency. We'll talk about that more. The purpose of the scientific approach is really to explore the relationship between variables. Now, if you've taken a stats class, I can probably hear your skin crawling right now, but we'll try to keep it short and painless in terms of discussing variables. Data in the scientific method is generally expressed in a quantitative way. I'm going to have you watch a little video on that. And then research tools. How do we actually go get data in the scientific approach? And we use surveys and experiments, and we're going to do a little class activity to help that make more sense. So again, we'll focus on the interpretive method in video number 3. Okay, so the scientific approach, you probably all remember this from 7th grade, right? Stating your hypothesis, testing your hypothesis. What are the advantages to using this scientific method? Well, there's 3 sort of big benefits, right? Objectivity, reliability, validity. Objectivity is the idea that by using this sort of strict process, scientists sort of keep their bias at the door, right? That it doesn't matter your religion, your gender, your age, your politics, that it keeps that bias sort of out of your research. Now, of course, this is easier said than done, and if you remember our discussion from Comte and Spencer, they very much disagreed over, can we truly be objective when it comes to researching people, but nonetheless know that that is the promise of the scientific method, objectivity. Another benefit is this idea of reliability, right? And if you haven't already listened to the podcast, The Scientific Method, please do listen to that because it focuses specifically on this issue of reliability. Reliability is really talking about, can your results be replicated, right? The idea is you do these steps, you come up with a conclusion, somebody else should be able to come behind you, do the same steps, and come up with the same conclusion. If they do, your results are considered reliable. If they don't, if they come up with a different conclusion, your results are not reliable. Now, this is really important when it comes to, researching cancer drugs, for example, right? You want reliable research results before you start making pharmaceuticals to cure cancer. But as you'll notice in the podcast, in terms of social science research, this issue of reliability, there's some questions about that, right? How important is it? And does it, if your research isn't reliable, does that mean it's bad research? So check that out if you haven't listened to it yet. Last benefit of scientific method, validity. Now this one's a little fuzzier, but validity means, are you researching what you think you're researching? I know that seems sort of no duh, but for example, there's lots and lots of research right now being done on happiness, right? Trying to measure happiness. Comparing, are baby boomers happier than Gen Xers and so forth. Seems pretty straightforward, but when you actually start doing it, it gets tricky. How do you measure happiness? Right? Lots of tools have been used to measure happiness, but it turns out that they've actually been measuring satisfaction, right? How satisfied people are with their lives, not necessarily how happy they are. Now that might seem a minor distinction, but it's an important one. So validity is, are you measuring what you think you're measuring? Homelessness, right? You may want to go do a study on homeless. Well, being really clear about, are you actually studying homelessness? Or are you studying mental illness? Right? So important distinctions. What I'd like you to do now is to pause this video and fill out the first part of that handout I gave in class, the Introduction to Research Methods. So this is what it looks like. So you have this first part up here. I just want you to do this. So here we have the steps in the research process, and down here we have the descriptions that match up with it. These are not in the right order, so what you need to do is match up these descriptions. Just put the number next to the step it goes with. That's the first thing. And then after you match those all up, then I want you over here, just 1 to 7, put these in the right order. 1 being the first step, 7 being the last step. So go ahead and pause this video, fill this out, and then come back to the video when you're done. Okay, welcome back. So hopefully that helped, right? Give you a sense of the steps in the scientific method. Now let's get to the whole purpose of the scientific method. Remember, it's the relationship between variables. Basically, we have two types of variables, right? Things that we sort of are interested in and explore when we do scientific research. We have our independent variable and we have our dependent variable. Now, it took me a long time to remember the difference. So the cheaty way I remembered, the dependent variable is the thing you're interested in, right? So let's say we're interested in children's test scores, how well they do on a standardized test. That would be our dependent variable. That's what we're interested in. Our independent variable is our guess at what might impact our dependent variable, right? So our dependent variable in this case is test scores. Our independent variable is our guess at what might be impacting a child's test score. So think of some potential independent variables. What are some things that could affect a child's test scores? Yeah, right? Things like sleep, food, housing situation, learning disabilities, right? Independent variables, the things that cause or impact our dependent variable. So again, I'd like you to pause this video, get out that class handout, and now I want you to focus on the bottom part here, right? So you'll see this over here, we have our hypotheses, independent variables, dependent variables, and I've left some blank spots here. I want you to fill in the blank spots. So let's look at number 1 here. So television violence increases aggressive behavior in children. According to this hypothesis, our dependent variable is aggressive behavior. That's what we're interested in. So in this hypothesis, identify the independent variable. What is our guess at what we think impacts or causes aggressive behavior? And go ahead and fill that in. And go ahead and fill in the blank spots here for the rest of this. And when you're done, come back to this video. Okay, so hopefully that little exercise helped you make sense of the difference between independent, dependent variable. Now we're going to talk about, well, so what? Why do we care about the relationship between independent and dependent variable? Well, by exploring the relationship, we can figure out if we're dealing with a causal relationship or a correlated relationship. So again, what I'd like you to do is to pause this video and watch the video on Canvas, Causation versus Correlation. And when you're done with that, come back to me and we'll finish this up. Okay, welcome back. So hopefully that was a helpful video, right? Causation versus correlation. Now causation, as she mentioned, kind of gets all the attention, right? These are all the headlines. We kind of saw this in that John Oliver video, right? Drinking red wine causes just as much healthy behavior as going to the gym, right? But hopefully you recognize we need to be really careful with causal relationships. Social science is not very good at that, right? Usually there's a number of independent variables that are impacting our dependent variable, and that's not a causal relationship. Generally, we're much better at correlation. And correlation means that there's some relationship, but it's not A causes B. So, for example, we were talking about test scores and sleep. We have found a pretty strong correlation, a strong relationship between how much sleep a kid gets and how well they do on a test. But of course, sleep isn't the only thing that affects test scores, other things. So sleep and test scores are correlated. Now down here, you have to be really careful what they call spurious correlations. Spurious is just a fancy Latin word for false. So when we say spurious correlation, we're talking about false relationships. So there's a kind of entertaining website that gives some examples of spurious or false correlations. Let's check that out. So spurious correlations. So let's look at this first silly example, right? So the U.S. spending on science, space, and technology is strongly correlated. There's a very strong relationship, at least according to the data, to suicides by hanging, strangulation, and suffocation, right? Almost 100% correlation, right? If you look at the data, oh my gosh, look how strongly related. Hurry, cut spending to science and space so people will stop hanging themselves. No, right? Hopefully you realize that while the data points may match up, this is a false relationship. They have absolutely nothing to do with one another. It just randomly matches up. Or here's another silly example of a spurious correlation, right? Number of people who drown by falling into a pool correlates fairly strongly with the number of films Nicolas Cage appeared in, right? So, oh my gosh, Nick, stop making films. People are drowning right and left. No, it's a spurious correlation, totally false. Now, obviously, these are some pretty silly examples of spurious correlations, but you can probably agree that in the real world, these false correlations get passed off of as legitimate all the time, and we need to be careful about that. Okay, so in terms of how data is actually expressed in the scientific method, it tends to be expressed in a quantitative approach, right? Versus the interpretive method, which we'll talk about in the next video, is much more qualitative. So again, I'd like you to pause this video and watch the video on Canvas, qualitative versus quantitative research, and when you're done with that, come back and we'll finish this up. Okay, welcome back. So last thing I want to talk about for scientific research is the tools, right? What tools do we have to actually go get information? There's three big ones for this scientific approach: surveys, experiments, and secondary data analysis. And you'll notice there's no perfect tool, right? Every tool has its strengths and weaknesses. We'll talk about ways social scientists try to make up for the weaknesses, but it's important to know, what can your tool do and what is it not very good at doing. So let's look at surveys. This is probably the one most people are familiar with. We've all taken surveys. There's some really important strengths to surveys, right? You can get large data sets, right? You can survey 1,000 people. And that's nice because then you can generalize your data. If you survey 1,000 college students, you can generalize your findings to all college students. That's kind of nice. Surveys are pretty good at capturing at what people think, right? And they're relatively easy and cheap to administer. So lots of strengths, but some important weaknesses. Surveys aren't very good at capturing context. Well, why do people think that, right? And while surveys are good at capturing what people think, they're not especially good at what people actually do, right? Oftentimes there's a discrepancy there. And connected to that, people often are not truthful on surveys, usually for very legitimate reasons. I had a colleague in grad school wanting to do a survey to see, people who were victims of domestic violence. Well, not everybody's going to be honest on a survey about something that's so personal and intimate to them, right? So again, strengths and weaknesses. Experiments, these are the ideal situation to explore relationships between variables. In an experiment, you can manipulate the independent variable to see if it has any impact on your dependent variable. So going back to our example of sleeping and test scores, right? You could take two groups of kids, let one sleep 8 hours a night, let another sleep 6 hours a night, and see if that had an impact on their test scores, right? You can manipulate that independent variable, sleep in this case. But there's some important weaknesses to experiments. The Hawthorne effect that your textbook talked about, right? This is the idea that people tend to change or can change their behavior if they know they're being researched, so that might undermine your results. And also you run into some ethical concerns with experiments, and we'll talk about that at the end of this series. Finally, the last tool, secondary data analysis. This is just a fancy word for you got to go to the library and do your homework, right? Secondary data analysis is researching what's been written on your topic before, right? Doesn't require any research participants, and of course you can only look at what's already been written. Okay, so go ahead and stop this, and then our next video is going to be on the interpretive method.